All right, great. So yeah, my name is Wirdum. For those who don't know me, I'm a journalist. I work for Bitcoin Magazine. I started writing about Bitcoin about 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago. I wrote my first article in Dutch for a blog I had at that time, where I was sort of countering the mainstream narrative about Bitcoin, which was very negative about that time. It was all Ponzi schemes, scams, criminals. Um, I started working for Bitcoin Magazine in 2015, and I became the technical editor there. So I sort of started breaking down technical concepts for a more mainstream audience, broader audience. This was also around the time that the block size war started, so I covered that a lot. Since then, I've done some other stuff. I do a podcast with Sjors Provost, one of the Bitcoin core developers. I've been to El Salvador for a while around the time that they were rolling out their Bitcoin project. But for the past 5 years, more or less, my main topic of interest has been Bitcoin's prehistory. So Bitcoin indeed did not come from nothing. There were other digital cash projects or people that were thinking about realizing this before Bitcoin itself. And I started to cover this as well. So there's a series called the Genesis Files for Bitcoin Magazine. I wrote some articles for the print magazines about these kinds of topics. But the main goal was always to turn this into a book. So this book is going to be released soon. It's called the Genesis book, and it tells the origin story of Bitcoin. Let's see, next slide. This clicker is not working for me. Is there an other button? Ah, there we go. That's the right button. So yeah, the origin story of Bitcoin. So I'm originally a historian, and then one of the struggles of a historian, or one of the questions you need to answer, is where do you actually start history? So how far do you go back? When it comes to Bitcoin's prehistory, I, in the book, kind of go back to two. The book sort of has two starting points, so two parts of Bitcoin history that throughout the book kind of merge together. One of them is economics, with a strong emphasis on Austrian economics and Hayek in particular, and the other is more technical. However, so in the book, this is sort of, I tell it in a sort of a chronological way. However, for this talk, it's probably a little bit easier if I try to make it into more of a chronological story. So the farthest back we can go is to Hayek and Keynes. These are Hayek and Keynes. This is actually, these are not really Hayek and Keynes. This is from a rap battle. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's actually pretty good. It's way better than it deserves to be. But one of the reasons it's good because it's actually pretty realistic. So Hayek, that's Hayek, by the way, that's Keynes. So they had a big debate. So Hayek was an Austrian economist. He was actually from Austria. And Austrian economics emerged in the 19th century and started with the marginalist revolution. So up until that point, most economists, they had this idea of the labor theory of value. So value is derived from whatever a product or service costs to produce it. And Austrians, Menger at first, they sort of flipped this on its head and they said, no, value is actually subjective. It's the subjective individual that that values thing and that wants thing that wants stuff, that has desires. So Hayek came from that tradition, and in the 1920s he went to New York to study the Federal Reserve, essentially. And so this was in the Roaring 20s, and one of the things he found was that the Federal Reserve had started using interest rates as a way to steer the economy. So increasing and decreasing interest rates across the economy as a way to sort of stabilize the economy. And he thought that was a very unsustainable idea. He thought it was a very bad idea because he thought that would misallocate resources and create bubbles in the economy. So he was basically right, I would say, because the bubble burst at the end of the 1920s with the Great Depression. So then in the 1930s, Hayek and Keynes had their sort of big debate. They reviewed each other's work. They wrote each other also privately. They had a public debate about how to deal with the aftermath of the Great Depression. Hayek believed that the free market should be left to its own devices. Keynes, however, thought that the government had a role in fixing things. So Keynes thought the government should invest in the economy. Hayek thought it should be left alone. Keynes won that debate in a way, more in a popular way, not in a being right way, or I would argue anyways. And Hayek did not. He lost that debate. Now, during this time, Hayek also started writing about money. Let's see. Yeah, so he started writing about money, and one of the things he wrote about, he didn't write about it a lot, but he did at one point describe what a ideal currency would look like. So what he described was a money with a fixed supply that could be used internationally. So a borderless currency with a fixed supply. Now he wrote about this a bit, but he didn't write about this a lot. So why didn't he write about this a lot? He didn't write this about it. He didn't write about this a lot because he thought it was not possible. This is just a highlight from one of his articles. The reason it's not possible is because he assumed that a currency like this would require some institution to maintain this. And institutions, in the end, can't be trusted. In the worst case, it has to be based somewhere. In the worst case scenario, it would break down, for example, because war breaks out and countries can't trust each other to actually maintain this fixed supply, for example. So he gave up on this idea. Even though he thought it was ideal, he just thought it was not possible, so he gave up on the idea, and he sort of accepted that probably gold is the best we can do. So that, he begrudgingly accepted that gold was probably the best form of money. So this was in the 1930s. Then fast forward to, I don't think this slide is complete, but that's okay. It's complete enough. Fast forward to the 1970s. Hayek kind of bowed out of writing about economics altogether, in part because Keynes kind of won the debate in a way, and he started focusing more on politics for a long time. And in the 70s, he returned and he started writing about money again. And this time he had a different idea, or a better idea. This time he figured, you know what, money should actually not be maintained by any government at all. It should be left to the free market altogether. So the free market, for example, free banking, free banks should be able to issue any currency they want, and people should be free to choose whatever currency they want. And that way, the best form of money will ultimately win out. Let's see, what's next? So he wanted to free money. But he recognized that to do that, governments would have to actually allow that. And governments actually benefited the most from fiat currency. They could, print money essentially if they wanted to. So he recognized that it was going to be a very uphill battle to make this happen. But he was advocating for a free money movement. That never really took off. And then a little bit later, in the 90s, he sort of adjusted his idea, so he still believed that money should be left to the free market. He just didn't really believe that that's something the government was ever going to allow. So at that point, he concluded that the only way to realize that is if people would create a free market currency that governments couldn't stop. So something that governments couldn't stop. And here we're going to make a jump to sort of the other storyline of the book. Something governments can't stop. Oh, this is a very pixelated picture on the big screen. So these are Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman. They created public key cryptography. So the backstory here is that Whitfield Diffie came from the hacker community. The hacker culture emerged at MIT starting in the 1950s, even 1960s. And Whitfield Diffie was there, and he was interested in cryptography. Cryptography at this time was really something for the army and secret agents and these kinds of institutions. It was not something for the public. However, he got the impression, or he got some wind of there being better forms of cryptography available. He got interested in that, and he thought that was something that should be publicly available, especially as computers and eventually the internet started to emerge. He thought it was important that people had a way to, well, there's two things. So let me finish that sentence. He wanted people to be able to communicate privately. But as I mentioned, there's two things. One of them is actually digital I always struggle with that word. Authentication. Did I get it right? Did I get it right, Pete? Thank you, Pete. Yeah, so a way to prove that a message you wrote is actually, you actually wrote it. So digital signatures. So that's one thing they tried to achieve. That was especially Whitfield Diffie's sort of goal there, and Martin Hellman was a little bit more interested in the private communication part of it. And at some point, so they were both thinking about these things. They didn't know each other at first, but Whitfield Diffie went on some sort of sprawl throughout the United States, speaking with cryptographers and mathematicians and these kinds of people to try to figure out a better way to do cryptography. At one point they met and they sort of through a collaborative effort figure out public key cryptography. So a way for people to both digitally authenticate their writings and also to communicate privately. Now this really unleashed a revolution in cryptography. It showed the potential of what was possible with math. From this, I think the next, yeah, so from here we go to David Chaum. So David Chaum is on the far right, and this is DigiCash. Yeah, David Chaum, he was also a cryptographer, and one of the things he invented, for example, were mixed networks. That's sort of the precursor of Tor. But he was also interested in creating a digital form of cash. So what does that mean in his in this context exactly? He wants to create something, a form of money that people could use anonymously. So a way for people to, pay for their goods and services without revealing to the rest of the world that they did so. So at first, this started out as like a toll booth project at DigiCash. This was in the Netherlands, by the way, in Amsterdam. And yeah, David Chaum's main goal was always to create a digital form of money. By the way, on the right, you see Nick Szabo, who some of you will probably know. He also worked at DigiCash. This ultimately didn't really work out. Well, so DigiCash, eCash, so the form of money they were working on, was launched, and there were some pretty big banks even that adopted it, like Deutsche Bank. I think also Swiss Bank, if that's the name of the bank here, the biggest bank. Is that the name of the biggest bank here? Swiss Bank? Something like that. No one knows. Where were we? Yeah, okay. So this didn't quite work out. And there's a big sort of debate on why it didn't work out. The people that worked at DigiCash don't really see eye to eye about that. Some former employees thought David Chaum wasn't a good businessman. David Chaum himself doesn't agree with that at all. He just says there wasn't any market for it. But anyway, so they did create this digital form of money, this digital cash, even though it didn't really catch on. All right, from here we go to the extropians. So the extropians, this was a movement in California. This may be one of the parts of the book or one of the parts of Bitcoin. Another pixelated picture. This big screen isn't helping with that. Another part of the Bitcoin prehistory that probably relatively many Bitcoiners don't know about. This was a movement in California that was very interested in science and technology. And they had very futuristic visions. So they were talking about mind uploading, colonizing space, other planets, and a big part of it was life extension. So they thought that medical advances in technology could ultimately lead to eternal life. It's kind of interesting that Max More, who's pictured in the middle, he's sort of the founder of that movement. Not his real name, but well, he changed his name to Max More because it's kind of an extropian name. He always wanted more. It's always about expanding and increasing and becoming better versions of yourself. Yeah, he sort of saw this as a substitute for religion. So he thought technology and science has been competing with religion, has been displacing religion in a way as a way to um, explain the world. But he thought religion wasn't exactly cutting it, or no, science and technology weren't exactly cutting it all together because it didn't really give meaning. So he thought he wanted to sort of give meaning to life through science and technology, and one of the things is eternal life, so sort of a bigger goal to achieve, and instead of life after death, just live forever. Uh, One of the ways, so there's different visions about achieving this, and the extropian vision specifically was a very free market, Hayekian-based way of doing that. So they thought if we reduce the role of government, if we let the free market do what it wants, then we'll ultimately achieve that vision. So one of the ways to reduce the role of government is by taking money out of the hands of government. So this Helvini, this is an article he wrote for the Extropian magazine, which was the magazine the Extropians published, in which they, spread and distributed all their futurist ideas. And Helvini was interested in, he was an Extropian and he was interested in electronic cash, the stuff Chaum was working on. And he, at one point, wrote this article for Extropian magazine about how it works, what electronic cash is, why Extropians should be interested in, how it could reduce the role of government. So he sort of sparked this idea within the Extropian community. The Extropians really embraced this idea. So a couple years later, there was a whole magazine about digital cash, an Extropian magazine about digital cash, in which several authors, including the founder Max Moore, wrote about the potential of digital cash. And this is sort of where the technical side, so the privacy side, the Chaum side, and the Austrian side, the Hayek side, which I explained earlier, sort of merged together. So Max Moore specifically, he wrote about Hayek's ideas about money and how Chaum's technology could help realize that idea. So from this point on, the two ideas started to kind of merge. So then we get to the cypherpunks. So the cypherpunks, they emerged from the Extropians. They emerged from the hacker culture and the Extropians, kind of both. So these are Tim May, Eric Hughes, and John Gilmore. You can't really recognize them, but I'm pretty sure, I'm actually sure that it's them. The cypherpunks, so they emerged from the Extropians and the hackers, and they set a goal to build privacy tools. So the internet was at this point emerging. They heard about all this thing Whitfield Diffie and Martin Hellman and other cryptographers were working on, but it wasn't really realized. Apart from David Chaum's DigiCash, and Eric Hughes actually worked for David Chaum as well for a little bit, so the guy in the middle. But he grew a bit disillusioned by what David Chaum was working on exactly. At some point he met with Tim May, who was a retired physicist. He retired pretty young. And they developed this idea of actually realizing privacy by building the technologies themselves. They got John Gilmore involved. And from there, a whole group started. They started meeting in the Bay Area and eventually started a... I don't have that much time left. We'll get there. And one of the things they really wanted to achieve as well is digital cash. So that's one of the main sort of holy grails projects that the cypherpunks started to work on. This is Adam Back's shirt. Adam Back was one of these cypherpunks. He was not actually, I didn't use a picture of Adam Back because I figure everyone knows what he looks like, but it's kind of a cool story. Adam Back was one of the cypherpunks. He was not one of the cypherpunks in California, but he was very active on the mailing list. He was one of the guys that was really pushing for digital cash, was growing very impatient. The reason he was growing impatient is because David Chaum, I didn't mention this yet, David Chaum had the patents on his digital cash design. So the cypherpunks couldn't really use that, and that was kind of frustrating the cypherpunks, including Adam Back. The story behind this shirt is that in the 90s there were the crypto wars. The American government wanted to restrict use of cryptography. They saw that as a security risk. And the cypherpunks were fighting against that. There were sort of activists trying to fight against the US government. And this shirt was sort of a statement by Adam Back. He wrote the RSA algorithm. Well, he printed the RSA algorithm on a t-shirt, and the idea was that if you were wearing this t-shirt while you left the United States, you were technically a weapons exporter. Adam Back created Hashcash. This was actually, at first, a response to spam, because among other things, the cypherpunk mailing list, but also the remailers, so the anonymity tools they were building, they were being spammed a lot. So they wanted to have something like postage to make it expensive for spammers to actually abuse their systems and their networks. So Adam Back created Hashcash, which was a way to, you basically hashed an email, which requires a little bit of computing power, and therefore it costs like a couple of cents to email someone, and that someone would only accept the email if the right hash was included. The idea being that if you send someone an email, this is like a trivial, it's just a couple of seconds of your computer. However, if you're a spammer and you want to send 1 million emails, it's going to be very expensive and it wouldn't be profitable to spam. What this introduced really as well was digital scarcity. So for the first time, you could have something digital that was provably tied to something from the physical world, so energy. So this was the idea that Adam Back introduced, and this was the idea that Nick Szabo, he's on the right, next to the legendary David Chaum, and me on the other side. I couldn't help myself but use this picture because I thought it was kind of cool. So Nick Szabo is on the right. He's at the conference as well. So he introduced BitGold, which was a way to essentially use Hashcash, use proof of work in a way that made it transferable. I don't think I have the time to go into the details. It's in my book, though. You can read it in my book. The idea was basically if you create a valid hash, it's tied to your public key, and you can then sign a message to send it to someone else. The ownership record was maintained by a sort of dedicated group of servers. The problem was that could be corrupted, so it suffered from the sock puppet problem, as Nick Szabo himself at one point described it. People could just sort of join that cluster and lie about transfers and lie about who owned what. So it wasn't really. So it was a proposal. So it was never implemented, but that was his idea. All right, let's move on. 3 minutes. This is White Eye. So White Eye is actually a very secretive guy. At the time of the cypherpunks, no one knew who he was. He never showed up. Some people thought he was. Some people thought he was a pseudonym. Some people they didn't know if he was a man or a woman. There are very few pictures of him. Even now, this is like one of the few pictures that are circulating of him on the internet. However, it's not actually him, so there's probably 0 pictures of him on the internet. The other pictures like on wiki pages, but it's not him. I don't think anyone knows who White Eye is, but he does exist. I know someone, he taught at the Singularity Institute, and I've had some contact with him myself. So White Eye was with Nick Szabo. They were on a sort of separate mailing list. So there was the Cypherpunks mailing list, and there was the LibTech mailing list, and the LibTech mailing list had some of the cypherpunks and then also some of the free banking people on there, and they were also discussing digital cash. One of the things, so White Eye came up with B-Money. He also a proposal that was never actually implemented, but he came up with B-Money, and it was sort of several ideas packed into one. But the most interesting one of these and the most relevant of these was a way to distribute the ledger. So I just spoke about BitGold, which has sort of this dedicated group of people maintaining it. White Eye proposed that maybe everyone can maintain it. So he proposed a really peer-to-peer system where every user would maintain a version of the ledger, and therefore everyone would check on everyone else that no one was cheating. The problem was he didn't know how to actually implement this. So it was an interesting idea, but it didn't really go anywhere because he didn't know how. 1 minute left. Okay, I'm going to have to rush through the last couple of slides. RPOW is an idea by Hal Vinny. he also came up with the digital cash project, which was also based on Hashcash. ARPA was actually centralized, so it was maintained on a central. It was maintained on a central server. The thing is that he used remote attestation, so the server would provably run specific software. This software was open source, and then anyone could check that this software was actually running on their servers. So that's how you would know that there was no cheating going on, because you knew what the server was actually doing. But it was also a proof of work-based system. Also, this was actually implemented, but also failed. Not sure what this is. Let's move to the next one. All right, the references. Oh, my time is up. Let me just wrap up. So one of the interesting things about the Bitcoin white paper, which was introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto, obviously, is that there wasn't actually anything new in there. Like, they were all concepts and ideas that already existed. Really, the only sort of new thing that he introduced was the difficulty algorithm. So that was a way to, let me just go to the next slide then, to maintain the fixed amount of coins. I think that's actually, this was only announced on, when he announced Bitcoin itself. So this wasn't in the white paper, but when he released the Bitcoin code, he announced that there would only be 21 million coins. So why is this important? I think it's important for two reasons. One of them is because it sort of realizes the original Hayek idea of a fixed money supply. The other one is that it's number go up technology, which is actually kind of important. If you look at several of the former digital cash projects that failed, ARPA perhaps most notably, but also DigiCash, one of the big problems was there was no actual incentive to adopt it. There's no reason for people to actually want to have it, to accept it, and therefore there's no reason for anyone to have it because no one's accepting it. And sort of a recurring, it has a trouble, starting out, bootstrapping itself. While Bitcoin, because it has this limited supply, actually does have this incentive in it. Because it's limited, and fiat is not, there's this incentive, the price is sort of predicted to go up. Halvini made a nice prediction about that. If you assume that Bitcoin is going to be successful, then how much would one Bitcoin be worth? And does it make the investment today worth it? So I think that's why the 21 million limit is actually very crucial. Okay, that's it. So the Genesis book is going to be released January 3rd, where I go into this whole story in more length. You can pre-order it. And yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks, everyone.